going more into the object orientation with UML, it's worthwhile to once again say that like last presentation, in this presentation it would be useful if you go through your own object-oriented programming lecture slides through. Overall, like said on the last presentation, the class and object are two sides of the same coin. The class is a definition. It's the mode which says what the object has, and the object, like in this picture, is the actual creation from the class definition. So the class definition stays always the same. It's made once, while the objects are private, independent, they have identity, they have different sorts of contents, and they have their own sets of variables which may have different information. So on this presentation we will go through a couple of the more simple things about objects and what sort of things they have. First of all, the class definition, as explained here, is the most fundamental part of UML notation. Each class has name, which is given in the first section of the definition, attributes, which are given on the next, and operation, which are given in the last block. These classes are always defined the same way. First the name, then the attributes, then the operations. With the operations and attributes, there's the group of icons right next to them. They define the visibility for the attribute if the attribute is public, private, or in some cases where the programming language supports this, protected. Basically, it means that how visible the attribute is and who can use the attribute and who can write to that attribute. On operations, the icon here, or the symbol here, represents the type of a method, what sort of data it returns to the class or instance that called that operation. For now it's irrelevant, but it may only means that when we return something, it gives us a type of information back, and on some occasions or programming languages it is important to know if it's a string, number or void, what can be expected back from the operation. Anyway, the class diagram always stays the same. In every diagram type in UML, classes are always defined the same way. So with attributes, you can also add information on what type we are expecting. For example, here we have string types, which is a generic text, and integer, which is a number without the floating point or decimals with it. So each object has its own attributes, and their attributes have their own information. So for each employee class defined here, we know that each class has first name, last name, address, person ID, and they are strings, and the employee ID, which is a number, an integer. The employee object, as defined here, tells us that the first name of this object is Joe, the last name of this object is Smith, and so on. So basically the attributes always store the information on that object. These attributes have the visibility, like mentioned earlier, and it's usually, well, always, it's dependent on the programming language what visibilities are supported, but they usually follow this pattern. They are either private, protected, or public. The private means that it's only and strictly for the internal use within that object. So if your attribute is private, it means that it's only visible and usable in operations which happen inside this particular object. It's a very good way to ensure that your data is not changed by anything external, and actually one of the most basic design patterns involves declaring all the attributes private, so that they are only you can only access them or manipulate them by calling the methods of that class. The other very usual visibility class is public, which means that you can always call or change or see that a particular variable or attribute just by calling its name. And this is sometimes useful, sometimes really dangerous, since it also means that anything from any part of your software or your system can change that particular attribute. The in-between them is protected. It's something that varies greatly between languages, and it's usually implemented so that it's only usable and visible to parent object. We go back into this idea of parent, or the main object and the client objects in next presentation, but it means that it's only visible to those objects that have some use for that particular attribute, or the classes or objects which are using that object as a part of their function. Similarly, the operation here defines how we can call the operation, how we can call that object, and what sort of activities we can do with that object. Of course, like mentioned earlier, the objects react to messages, and this is the main way we can use the objects or get information from them, and that's the intended main way of accessing the attributes within the objects. There's also additional thing which we will be talking about in the boundary control and entity design, and it's a stereotype. The stereotype, defined in the name part here, is sort of an abstract classification for the class. It means that we are defining sort of functionality for the class. Like here we are using a stereotype data sheet on this account class, meaning that the class defines something that's one complete data set for something, or that it's a data sheet for account. We could also have data sheet for person or data sheet for car or anything like that. And it's expected to do some things like hold all the relevant information and give more information about and allow printing functions and manipulation functions for that particular data. In BCE model, which is also talked about in this course, we, for example, have three stereotypes. The boundary, which means that this class has something to do with communication with either other systems or users or actors, meaning that it's a communication or user interface implementation. The control, which means that it implements complex algorithm or provides functionalities to other classes and objects, or entity, which is meant that this class or object created from this class is mostly used to hold data or be an implementation of a database system. So basically these are the main parts of class definition and the things that are more or less the fundamental building blocks of classes and data manipulation in UML system. So we have name, and we may also have stereotype for the class. We have the internal data, attributes, and we have the activities, methods that one object and the class can do.